On the western coast of southern Africa lies Angola, a country that is both vast and often misunderstood. It faces the Atlantic Ocean, borders Namibia, Zambia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and includes Cabinda, a separate exclave north of the main territory. Angola is the seventh largest country in Africa and one of the largest Portuguese-speaking nations in the world, second only to Brazil in area and population. Its capital, Luanda, is a booming coastal city where luxury towers, crowded neighborhoods, oil money, and deep inequality exist side by side. To understand Angola, you have to look beyond a single label. It is not just an oil state, not just a former colony, and not just a country recovering from war. It is a place shaped by ancient states, global trade, colonial violence, Cold War politics, and a difficult search for shared prosperity. Angola's geography has always influenced its history. The Atlantic coast connected the region to maritime trade, first with neighboring African societies and later with Europeans. Inland, Angola stretches across plateaus, river systems, savannas, forests, and semi-arid zones. These landscapes supported different ways of life, from farming and herding to long-distance trade and political organization. Cabinda adds another layer of complexity. It is separated from the rest of Angola by a strip of territory belonging to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, yet it became part of Angola through colonial-era arrangements. Today, Cabinda is important because of its oil resources, but it has also been the center of separatist tensions. Angola's size, varied terrain, and fragmented colonial borders help explain why building a unified modern state has been such a challenging project. Long before European ships arrived, the region that became Angola was home to complex societies. Human habitation goes back to the Paleolithic age, but a major historical turning point came with the Bantu expansion. Bantu-speaking peoples moved into the region over centuries, bringing new languages, agriculture, ironworking, and forms of political organization. By the 13th century, states and confederations had emerged. These were not isolated villages waiting to be discovered. They were organized societies with rulers, diplomacy, trade networks, and military power. Different kingdoms controlled different regions, and their interactions shaped the political map of West Central Africa. This older history matters because it challenges the idea that Angola began with colonization. In reality, colonial Angola was imposed over a landscape that already had its own institutions, identities, and rivalries. Among the most important pre-colonial powers was the Kingdom of Congo, which rose from the 14th century and became a dominant force in the region. Congo had a centralized monarchy, provincial structures, and broad influence across parts of present-day Angola, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Republic of the Congo, and Gabon. When Portuguese explorers established relations with Congo in 1483, the encounter began as diplomacy between political powers, not simply conquest from the start. To the south were other influential kingdoms, including Dongo and Matamba. Farther south were Ovimbundu kingdoms, and in the east the Mbunda kingdom. These societies were distinct, and their relationships with Portugal varied from alliance to resistance. Angola's later colonial history cannot be understood without recognizing this mosaic of African states that negotiated, fought, adapted, and survived. Portuguese influence deepened in the 16th century, especially along the coast. What began as contact and trade increasingly turned into colonization, military expansion, and control of labor. The slave trade became central to Angola's place in the Atlantic world. Enslaved people from the region were transported across the ocean, especially to Brazil, linking Angola's history to the wider Portuguese Empire. Congo fought multiple wars against the Portuguese, while Ndongo became a major target of Portuguese expansion. The Portuguese conquest of Ndongo marked a major step in the growth of colonial power. Yet control was uneven for centuries. The Portuguese often dominated ports and trade corridors more than the entire interior. African rulers and communities resisted, negotiated, and sometimes used Portuguese alliances for their own political goals. In the 19th century, the banning of the slave trade disrupted economic systems that had become dangerously dependent on it. For Congo and other societies tied into Atlantic commerce, this created instability and forced adaptation. At the same time, European imperial competition intensified. Portugal, eager to defend its claims in Africa, gradually pushed deeper into the interior. But Angola's present borders were not firmly established until the early 20th century. That process involved military campaigns and strong resistance from local groups, including the Kwamato, the Kwanyama, and the Mbunda. Colonial rule was not a simple administrative project. It was built through coercion, forced labor, land seizures, and racial hierarchy. The modern shape of Angola was therefore created through a combination of imperial ambition and African resistance. By the mid-20th century, Angola was still ruled by Portugal, even as much of Africa was moving toward independence. Portugal's authoritarian government insisted that its African colonies were overseas provinces, not colonies at all. But for many Angolans, the reality was political exclusion, economic exploitation, and limited rights. In 1961, a protracted anti-colonial struggle began. Several liberation movements emerged, each with different regional, ideological, and international connections. The MPLA, or People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, became one of the most important. UNITA, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, also became a major force. The FNLA, the National Liberation Front of Angola, drew support from Zaire. In Cabinda, a separate movement sought independence for the exclave. The independence struggle was therefore not one united front, but a battlefield of competing visions. Angola achieved independence in 1975, but freedom arrived with tragedy. Instead of a peaceful transition, the country immediately descended into civil war. The conflict was rooted in rival liberation movements, regional divisions, competition for power, and the wider Cold War. The MPLA took control of the state and received support from the Soviet Union and Cuba. UNITA, originally influenced by Maoism and later strongly anti-communist, was supported by the United States and South Africa. The FNLA had backing from Zaire, while the Cabinda separatist movement also received outside support. Angola became more than a national conflict, it became a proxy battlefield where global and regional powers pursued their own interests. For ordinary Angolans, the cost was immense: displacement, destroyed infrastructure, landmines, poverty, and decades of uncertainty. The Angolan Civil War lasted, in different phases, until 2002. That means an entire generation grew up knowing little but war. Roads, schools, hospitals, and farms were damaged or abandoned. Millions of people were displaced internally or fled abroad. Rural areas were especially devastated, and landmines remained a deadly legacy long after fighting stopped. The war also shaped the country's political culture. Power became highly centralized, security concerns dominated national life, and the ruling MPLA remained the dominant political force. When the war finally ended, Angola faced the enormous task of reconstruction. Peace did not automatically solve the country's problems, but it created the possibility of rebuilding the state, reopening transport routes, attracting investment, and reconnecting communities that had been separated by decades of violence. After 2002, Angola emerged as a relatively stable constitutional republic, and its economy became one of the fastest growing in the world for a time. The main driver was oil. Petroleum exports brought in enormous revenue, especially as global demand rose and international investors arrived. China, the European Union, and the United States became major investment and trade partners. Chinese financing, in particular, supported large infrastructure projects, including roads, railways, housing, and public buildings. Luanda transformed rapidly, becoming one of Africa's most expensive cities. But Angola's boom was fragile because it depended heavily on oil prices. When prices fell, the weaknesses became clearer: limited diversification, corruption concerns, debt pressures, and a gap between impressive national statistics and everyday living conditions for much of the population. One of Angola's central challenges is inequality. The country has generated vast wealth, yet much of it has been concentrated among a relatively small segment of society. Many Angolans still face low living standards, limited access to quality healthcare, unreliable services, and high costs of living. Life expectancy remains low compared with many countries, while infant mortality has been among the highest in the world. This contrast is striking, a state rich in oil and natural resources, but a population where many people do not experience the benefits of that wealth. The problem is not only economic, it is institutional. Turning resource wealth into broad development requires transparent governance, effective public services, diversified industries, rural investment, and education systems that can support opportunity beyond the oil sector. Angola today is a country of more than 36 million people, with a culture shaped by both indigenous traditions and centuries of Portuguese influence. Portuguese is the official and dominant language, and the Catholic Church has had a major historical role, but Angola is also home to many ethnic groups, local languages, music traditions, foods, and regional identities. It is a member of the United Nations, the African Union, the Community of Portuguese Language Countries, and the Southern African Development Community. Its future depends on whether it can turn stability into inclusion. Angola has survived colonization, slave trading networks, anti-colonial war, and one of Africa's longest civil wars. The question now is whether its immense resources, young population, and strategic position can support a more equal and resilient society. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.